My neighbor stole my cat, so I got revenge. It all started on a regular Thursday afternoon. I was lounging in my living room when I noticed that my cat, Whiskers, wasn't curled up on the windowsill like usual. I glanced around the room and called out, "Whiskers? Whiskers." No response. I shrugged it off. Maybe she was outside soaking up the sun or playing in the backyard. But as the hours passed, I began to grow concerned. Whiskers was an indoor cat. She hated being outside for too long. I checked the backyard. No sign of her. I called the neighbors on either side of me, but they hadn't seen her either. I felt a sinking feeling in my stomach. Whiskers was nowhere to be found. That's when I started to get suspicious. A few days ago, I had noticed something strange. My neighbor, Mr. Thompson, had been acting a little off. Normally a quiet, reclusive man, he had suddenly started coming over to talk to me more. At first, I thought it was just friendly, neighborly chatter, but then I noticed something odd. He would always ask about Whiskers. Not in a casual way, either. It was like he was obsessed. He'd ask, "How's your cat doing?" Whiskers, right? Is she okay? Is she getting enough playtime? At first, I brushed it off. People like cats, right? But now, as I walked around the house looking for her, it hit me. Could it be that Mr. Thompson had taken her? I rushed over to his house. He had a big, imposing home that always seemed a little too dark, even in the middle of the day. I knocked on the door, my heart pounding in my chest. After a few moments, the door creaked open, and there stood Mr. Thompson, wearing a suspiciously tight-lipped smile. "Hello there," he said, his voice a little too cheery. "What can I do for you?" "Have you seen my cat, Whiskers?" I asked, trying to stay calm but unable to hide the panic in my voice. "She's gone missing, and I think she might have wandered into your yard." "Oh no," he said, feigning surprise. "I haven't seen her, but if I do, I'll be sure to let you know." He leaned forward, lowering his voice to a whisper. "I've always thought she was such a sweet cat. Maybe you could bring her over sometime so she can play with my cats." His eyes glinted with something I couldn't quite place. I nodded, though my gut was telling me that something was off. "Thanks," I said, walking away. I couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Thompson knew exactly where Whiskers was. That night, I stayed up late, brainstorming ways to get her back. I knew I had to be careful. If Mr. Thompson had taken her, it was likely because he wanted her for himself, and I wasn't about to let that happen. Then, it hit me. What if I could lure her back? I didn't have to confront him directly, not yet anyway. But I could play a little trick on him. The next day, I began setting up my plan. I placed a collar with a little bell on it around a fake cat I'd made, a stuffed animal that looked surprisingly real, with fluffy fur and a tail that swished back and forth when I gently tugged at it. I didn't want to risk using Whiskers' actual collar, just in case it gave me away too easily. I waited for Mr. Thompson to leave his house for his usual walk in the afternoon. As soon as he was out of sight, I carefully placed the stuffed cat by his front door, making sure it was positioned just so it would look like Whiskers had wandered up to his house. Then I waited. It wasn't long before I saw Mr. Thompson return. He approached the door, looking down at the fake cat. A confused expression crossed his face, and for a moment I thought he might suspect something. But then his eyes lit up with excitement. "Well, well, what's this?" he muttered to himself, scooping the fake cat up and bringing it inside. I smirked, knowing that he was about to fall for my trap. I waited until the evening, then snuck over to his house. Using my best stealth moves, I made my way to the backyard. I'd noticed before that Mr. Thompson had a cat door in the back, and I was willing to bet that he had Whiskers in there, hidden away. I pushed open the door and tiptoed inside. The house was quiet, and I had to hold my breath to avoid making any noise. I followed the soft mewing sounds that led me to a small room at the back, where I finally found her. Whiskers, lounging lazily on a velvet cushion, surrounded by an array of toys. "Whiskers," I whispered, rushing over to her. She looked up, startled, but then purred when I picked her up. She was in no danger, just a little confused. I knew what I had to do next. I carefully tied a little note to her collar that read, "Thanks for the cat sitting. Don't try it again. Your neighbor." As I made my way out of the house, I took one last look at Mr. Thompson's collection of cats in his living room. It was a weird, unsettling scene, but I wasn't about to let him steal my Whiskers for good. By the time I got home, I was smiling. Whiskers was safe, and Mr. Thompson had learned a valuable lesson. As for me, I'd sleep easy knowing that I had outsmarted the sneaky neighbor, all thanks to a little bit of clever thinking and a lot of determination. And as I lay in bed that night, with Whiskers curled up beside me, I couldn't help but think, revenge is a dish best served with a cat. The next few days passed without incident. Mr. Thompson didn't seem to mention anything about the cat-sitting incident, and I thought that perhaps, just maybe, he'd learned his lesson. Whiskers was happily back to her usual routine, lounging by the window, chasing her toys, and giving me that satisfied little meow every now and then when I gave her some extra attention. But deep down, I knew things weren't quite over. It was a Sunday afternoon when I first noticed it. I was sitting outside, sipping on a cold lemonade, enjoying the warmth of the sun, when I saw Mr. Thompson pulling into his driveway. But instead of his usual leisurely walk, he was practically marching towards my house, his face tight and red. I felt a chill run down my spine. There was no mistaking that look. He was furious. He didn't even knock. He just walked right up to my front door, pushing it open without so much as a hello. I stood up from my chair, feeling the air shift between us. "Did you send that note?" Mr. Thompson demanded, his voice low but seething. His usually mild-mannered demeanor was completely gone, replaced by an intensity I'd never seen before. I raised an eyebrow, trying to stay calm. "What note?" "I have no idea what you're talking about." He stepped closer, his finger pointing directly at me. "The one tied to the cat's collar. You think you can just pull one over on me? You think I don't know what you did?" A wave of satisfaction washed over me, but I kept my expression neutral. "Well, it seems like you did know what I did. That's impressive. But for the record, I don't have a clue what you're talking about. You must have mistaken my cat for another one." The tension in the air was thick, but I could see Mr. Thompson's anger slowly begin to turn into something else. Something I recognized. Pride. He crossed his arms over his chest and sneered at me. "Don't think you can get away with this," he warned, his voice dangerously quiet. "I will get her back. Whiskers is mine now, whether you like it or not." I could feel my blood run cold. I was about to lose my cool, but I quickly took a breath and steadied myself. "She's not yours, Mr. Thompson. She belongs to me. And if you try to take her again, I won't hesitate to get the law involved." For a moment, we stood there, locked in a silent standoff. But then, to my surprise, Mr. Thompson's expression softened. His lips twitched as if he were suppressing a grin. "You think you can stop me?" he asked, his voice suddenly much more amused than angry. "You've made a powerful enemy today. I hope you're ready for the consequences." Before I could respond, he turned and walked back to his house, leaving me standing there, more confused than ever. It wasn't until that night that I understood what he meant. Whiskers didn't come home. I checked the house, the backyard, the front yard. Nothing. I called her name, but the only sound I heard was the rustling of leaves in the wind. I didn't panic at first. I thought she might just be outside exploring. But when hours passed and she still hadn't returned, I started to feel a pit in my stomach. That's when I realized. Mr. Thompson had taken her again. I couldn't believe it. This time he'd crossed a line. It wasn't just about his obsession with my cat. It was about power. He wanted control. And to make matters worse, he had no idea just how far I was willing to go to get her back. I wasn't going to play nice anymore. No more tricks. It was time for real revenge. I waited until the middle of the night when the moon hung high and the street was quiet. I grabbed my trusty flashlight and a few basic supplies, gloves, a lockpick, and a hidden camera I'd recently bought in case I needed evidence of Mr. Thompson's shady behavior. I was going to break into his house and rescue Whiskers once and for all. Sneaking through the dark yard, I reached his back door. The cat door was still there, a small, innocuous opening at the base of the door. I knew it was my only way in. I crouched low, peeking through the crack to see if he was in the room. I could hear faint snoring from inside. He was asleep. Perfect. With practiced precision, I slipped my lockpick into the door's mechanism. It only took a minute, but it felt like hours. Finally, the door clicked open. I stepped inside, careful not to make a sound. The house was eerily quiet, and the faint scent of lavender and stale air made my stomach turn. I moved quickly but quietly, following the soft thud of Whiskers' meows until I reached the living room. There, in the dim light, was Whiskers, sitting on a plush chair, staring at the door, as if she were waiting for me. Her eyes widened in recognition when she saw me, and without hesitation, she leapt down and trotted over, purring loudly. I scooped her up, hugging her close to me. But just as I turned to leave, I heard a voice. "You think you can just waltz in here and take her back? You really don't understand, do you?" I froze. Mr. Thompson was standing in the doorway, his silhouette barely visible in the low light. "I know exactly what I'm doing," I said, keeping my voice calm but steady. "And I'm taking her back where she belongs." There was a long pause. Then, in a voice tinged with something unsettling, almost admiration, he spoke. "You're clever, I'll give you that. But next time, don't think I'll be so lenient." And just like that, he stepped aside, letting me walk out of his house with Whiskers in my arms. The next morning, Whiskers was back to her old self, curled up in her favorite spot by the window. As for Mr. Thompson, I knew this wouldn't be the last time he'd try something. He was stubborn, relentless even. But one thing was certain. I was ready for whatever came next. No one was taking my cat again. A few weeks passed, and things settled into a familiar, uneasy routine. Whiskers seemed none the worse for wear after her second brief kidnapping, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Thompson was still plotting something. The tension between us was thick, like a cloud that hung just above the neighborhood, waiting for the right moment to strike. It started with small things. I'd wake up in the morning to find strange little notes left on my doorstep. Nothing overtly threatening, just cryptic messages like, "You don't know who you're dealing with," or "Whiskers belongs where she's appreciated." At first, I thought they were just random acts of annoyance, but the more I saw them, the more I realized Mr. Thompson was escalating his tactics. Then, one evening, things took a much darker turn. I had just gotten home from work, and as usual, I called out for Whiskers, but this time there was no response. No pitter-patter of paws running to greet me. My heart skipped a beat as I rushed around the house, calling her name. My stomach twisted into a knot. She wasn't anywhere. That's when I saw it. On the kitchen counter, neatly folded and sitting on top of a pile of papers, was another note. This one was different. There was a picture of Whiskers, clearly taken recently, her little face staring out from behind the blinds of Mr. Thompson's house. The note read, "She's here. And she's happier than she's ever been. You've been warned." My blood ran cold. I could barely breathe as I read the words over and over. Mr. Thompson had done it again. He'd taken her. But this time, he wasn't hiding it. He was taunting me. I grabbed my phone and immediately dialed the police, my hands shaking. I didn't know if they could do anything. They hadn't been much help the first time around, but I had to try. After a long conversation with the officer, I hung up, feeling more frustrated than ever. They said it was just a case of disputed property, and that unless Mr. Thompson openly admitted to taking Whiskers, there was little they could do. I was on my own. I didn't know what to do. Whiskers had been a part of my life for so long, and now she was gone again. But I wasn't about to give up without a fight. I had to get her back, once and for all. That night, I began planning. I couldn't just barge into Mr. Thompson's house and hope for the best. Not this time. I needed something more concrete, something that would put an end to this once and for all. I did a little research on his background, digging through public records and old neighborhood gossip. What I learned was unsettling. Mr. Thompson wasn't just a quiet man. He had a history. It wasn't enough to get the authorities involved, but it was enough to make me realize that I had to tread carefully. This man had more at stake than just a cat. There was something deeper here, something I wasn't seeing. Then it hit me. I had an idea. I wasn't the only one who had been noticing this strange behavior. My neighbor, Mrs. Martinez, had mentioned a few weeks ago that she thought she had seen Mr. Thompson with another woman, someone who wasn't his wife, sneaking into his house at odd hours. Could it be that there was more to Mr. Thompson's obsession with Whiskers than just a love of cats? What if he was trying to create the perfect life, even at the expense of those around him? I had to confront him again, but this time I needed leverage. The next day, I gathered a few things: a camera, a microphone, and most importantly, a plan. I wasn't going to let him get away with this. I was going to catch him in the act, proof that he had been taking Whiskers, keeping her against my will, and tormenting me with these twisted games. I waited until the sun had set, the quiet of the night settling in. This time, I wasn't sneaking in. I was going to be bold. I parked a few houses down and walked up to his door, my heart racing. I knocked, loudly, hoping to catch him off guard. Moments later, the door swung open. "What do you want now?" Mr. Thompson's voice was as cold as ice, his eyes narrowing as he stood in the doorway. "I'm here to end this," I said, my voice steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "I know what you're doing. I know what you've been doing." His face twitched, and I could see the corner of his mouth curl up into a smirk. "You've got no proof. You can't stop me." "I don't need proof," I shot back. "I just need you to admit it. I know you've been keeping my cat, against my will. And if you don't give her back, I'll make sure everyone in the neighborhood knows exactly what you've been up to." His smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "You think you scare me? You've underestimated me from the start." Before I could react, he shoved me aside and slammed the door in my face. I stood there, stunned for a moment. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A soft meowing sound. Unmistakable. It was Whiskers. I could hear her through the wall, faint but real. I wasn't leaving without her. I quickly called the police again, but I knew this time I had to take matters into my own hands. As I waited for backup, I placed my hidden camera at the edge of his front yard, aimed right at the window where I heard Whiskers' cries. I didn't know how long it would take, but I was determined to have the evidence I needed. I wasn't going to let this man control me, control my life any longer. Minutes later, the door opened again, and this time I heard footsteps approaching. Mr. Thompson came into view, but he wasn't alone. He was carrying Whiskers, her eyes wide and her body tense. She didn't belong there, and we both knew it. In that moment, I felt a surge of anger and determination flood through me. As the camera captured the scene, I stepped forward and confronted him one final time. "Give her back," I said, my voice firm, unyielding. Mr. Thompson's face twisted into a furious expression, but just as he opened his mouth to say something, the flashing lights of a police car illuminated the street. The backup had arrived. In the end, it was my determination, the camera footage, and the support of my neighbors that forced Mr. Thompson to finally let go of my cat. He was taken into custody for his actions, and though I didn't know what would happen to him next, I knew one thing for certain. Whiskers was finally, truly home. As I held her in my arms that night, I couldn't help but feel a sense of victory. No matter what Mr. Thompson tried, no matter how many times he thought he could win, I had proven that nothing would keep me from the ones I loved. And for now, that was enough. The weeks following Mr. Thompson's arrest were a strange kind of relief. Whiskers had adjusted back to her normal, carefree self, lounging in her favorite spots and chasing the occasional dust bunny with the kind of innocent joy that only a cat could embody. As for me, I was slowly starting to feel like I could breathe again, no longer looking over my shoulder, constantly anticipating Mr. Thompson's next move. But the quiet was deceptive. The darkness that had loomed over the neighborhood for so long was, it seemed, just waiting for the right moment to resurface. One evening, as I sat on the porch with Whiskers curled up on my lap, I noticed something strange out of the corner of my eye. The house across the street, Mr. Thompson's, wasn't empty. There were lights on inside, and I could see the silhouette of someone moving behind the curtains. I squinted, unsure of what I was seeing. It had been weeks since he'd been taken away, and yet it seemed as though someone had returned to the house. Someone tall, with a shadowy presence. The same kind of presence that had made me wary of Mr. Thompson in the first place. I shook my head. It was probably just another tenant, or perhaps a relative dealing with the aftermath. I couldn't bring myself to think too much about it. After all, I had done what was needed to get Whiskers back, and now things were finally calm. But as the days passed, the feeling of unease returned. I began noticing small details. Strange cars parked outside late at night, flickering lights, the occasional sound of movement coming from Mr. Thompson's property. It was subtle at first, but the pattern was unmistakable. Then, one morning, as I walked to the mailbox, I spotted a figure standing by the old fence that separated our properties. It was a man, not Mr. Thompson, but someone I hadn't seen before. He was tall, with dark hair and a long coat, staring at my house with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. When he saw me approach, he quickly turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows. I rushed inside, my heart pounding. Who was that? Could he have been connected to Mr. Thompson? The unease I had been trying to ignore was now impossible to shake. I didn't want to be paranoid, but everything in my gut told me that something wasn't right. I decided to do some more digging. A quick search of public records revealed that Mr. Thompson had a brother, one who was also known to be reclusive and involved in some questionable activities. It seemed that his brother had been in and out of jail for various offenses, but the details were murky. No one in the neighborhood had ever mentioned him before, and yet it seemed like he was now making his presence known. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I knew one thing for sure. If Mr. Thompson had been keeping secrets, they didn't end with him. His brother could be the next piece of the puzzle, and possibly another threat to Whiskers and me. That night, I decided to take a more direct approach. I wasn't going to let this guy sneak around my neighborhood unnoticed. Armed with my phone and a sense of determination, I decided to stake out the house across the street. I parked a few houses down, keeping my headlights off to blend into the shadows, and waited. It wasn't long before I saw the figure again, the same tall man in the dark coat. He was walking around the property, examining the windows and peering into the garage. He looked like he was searching for something, or someone. I felt my heart race. This was no coincidence. I couldn't ignore it anymore. As I watched, the man finally made his way to the front door of Mr. Thompson's house, and before I could react, the door swung open. A woman emerged from the shadows, a tall, dark-haired figure who was clearly expecting him. She embraced him like an old friend. I watched, stunned, as they exchanged a few whispered words before disappearing inside. This was it. This was the break I needed. The next day, I couldn't get the image of that woman out of my mind. Who was she? What was she involved in? And most importantly, why had she been so interested in Mr. Thompson's house after his arrest? I called in a favor from an old friend of mine who worked in local law enforcement. He was a private investigator now, specializing in tracking down people who didn't want to be found. I filled him in on everything. Mr. Thompson, his brother, the strange woman, the late-night visits, and asked him to look into it. He promised he'd get back to me, but I couldn't wait. I needed answers, and I needed them now. I decided to confront the woman. The next evening, I walked over to Mr. Thompson's house once again. This time, I wasn't going to wait for her to make the first move. I was going to take control. I knocked on the door, and after a few moments, the same woman from the night before appeared. Her eyes flickered with surprise, and I could see the tension in her body as she realized who I was. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady but guarded. "I think you know why I'm here," I said, my voice calm but assertive. I want answers. Who are you? And what are you doing here? She took a step back, her lips curling into a faint smile. You're a very determined one, aren't you? She said, looking me over. Fine. I'll tell you what you want to know. But not here. Not now. I felt a shiver of uncertainty, but I couldn't back down. Tell me, or I'll go straight to the police. She studied me for a moment, then sighed almost reluctantly. His name's Jacob Thompson, Mr. Thompson's brother. He's been trying to clean up the mess his brother left behind. I'm just helping him. I stood there, processing the words. Clean up? What kind of mess? Don't play dumb, she said, her voice suddenly sharp. Your cat wasn't the only thing he was after. He's been watching you, both of you, for a while now. He won't stop until he gets what he wants. My stomach twisted. What does he want with me? She took a deep breath, her eyes flickering nervously to the side before she leaned in closer. That's what I'm trying to figure out, too. The tension in the air thickened as I stared at the woman. Her words hung in the space between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. My heart raced as I processed everything she had just told me. Jacob Thompson, Mr. Thompson's brother. Watching us? What did he want with me? Before I could ask another question, there was a loud, abrupt sound from inside the house. A crash, followed by a series of hurried footsteps. My pulse spiked. I instinctively stepped back, but the woman, whose calm demeanor was now replaced with a flicker of panic, grabbed my arm. He's here. He's here, she whispered urgently, pulling me toward the side of the house. What's going on? What does he want? I asked, my voice a mixture of fear and confusion. She didn't answer immediately. She was looking toward the front door as though weighing her options. Finally, she turned to me, her eyes wide with something I couldn't quite place. Fear, perhaps? Or regret. He's not just after your cat anymore. He wants you, your life. I barely had time to react before the door to the house swung open with a violent crash. Jacob Thompson stood in the doorway, his broad frame silhouetted against the dim light inside. His eyes, wild and unblinking, locked on me with the intensity of a predator. Get away from her, he growled, his voice low and menacing, his hands flexing at his sides. I backed away, but the woman, in a sudden, reckless move, shoved me behind her. She raised her hands in the air, a futile attempt to calm the situation. Jacob, stop. This isn't the way, she began. But Jacob ignored her, his gaze still fixed on me. I could see the madness behind his eyes, the years of manipulation and secrecy unraveling in his mind. His fingers twitched as if he were contemplating the next move, and I knew I had seconds before things went terribly wrong. I didn't think. I reacted. With a desperate move, I darted to the side, grabbing a nearby rock from the garden and throwing it toward the window beside the door, shattering the glass with a sharp crack. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give me a split-second advantage. Jacob turned, his eyes narrowing in fury. You think you can escape? Think again. I bolted, my breath ragged as I sprinted toward the backyard, my heart thudding in my chest. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps heavy and determined. The woman's voice echoed behind me, faint but urgent. Run! Get to the street, don't stop. But as I reached the back gate, I realized too late that I wasn't alone. Another figure stepped out of the shadows. His figure, Mr. Thompson. He was back. I told you you'd never get away, Mr. Thompson sneered, his expression full of twisted satisfaction. He stepped forward, blocking my path. I froze, realizing I was trapped. Two men, both dangerous. No way out. I could feel the weight of their presence closing in, but I refused to surrender. My hand tightened around the flashlight I'd grabbed earlier from my bag. In one fluid motion, I swung it toward Jacob's head, catching him off guard. He staggered back, surprised but not fully knocked out. It was just enough time. I turned, racing in the opposite direction, slamming through the back gate and running toward the street. The cool night air hit me like a slap in the face, but the adrenaline fueled me forward. Whiskers was waiting for me at home, but I could still hear them behind me, could still feel their eyes. Hungry, determined, relentless. I knew this wouldn't end until I made a stand. Whiskers. My life, my sanity. All of it was worth the fight. By the time I reached the end of the street, my legs were burning, my heart pounding in my chest like a drum. A car passed and I waved it down, desperate for help. The moment the driver saw my face, they slammed on the brakes, rolling down their window. "Get in! Quick!" they shouted. Without hesitation, I leaped into the car. The driver slammed the door shut and we sped off, leaving the darkened house behind. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, a chill ran down my spine. The street was empty, but I could still feel their eyes on me. Jacob and Mr. Thompson, out there in the darkness, watching, waiting for the next move. The fight was far from over, and I didn't know if I'd ever be safe again, if I'd ever be